What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the First Class Lacrosse Podcast. We have a great discussion on tap today. We had another good weekend of lacrosse, and we're excited to dive in. Touch on rankings and ball reversals later in the show. I'm joined by my co-hosts, Stephen Rehfuss and Matt Dunn. I'm going to pass it off to Matt to introduce our segments for today.
Awesome. Thank you, Deemer. Today we have a similar structure. We're going to kick it off with Stephen with the 2-minute drill, running through some players' notable performances and games from this past weekend. Quickly get into our players' perspective segment where we'll talk about rankings, as Deemer mentioned. Then we'll get into games, players, and units. That's our GPUs. Then lastly, we'll get into trends, which we're going to look at some ball reversals, offensive units, and their flow and ball movement. And then we'll wrap it up looking ahead at this next upcoming weekend. Steven, you want to kick us off here with the 2-minute drill?
All right. Thanks, guys. Big weekend of college lacrosse last weekend. On the men's side, some notable games. Princeton 11, Rutgers 5. Ohio State with a big win over Notre Dame, 10-9. I know we were talking about, interested to see what Ohio State looked like. That's 2 ACC wins for them from that earlier season win against Virginia. Providence beat Loyola by 1. Loyola moves to 0-6 with 3 one-goal losses on the season, including the 1-goal losses to Maryland and to Hopkins. Harvard with a big win, 14-11 over Michigan. Yale gets in the win column with a 15-10 win over Denver. Penn State, Cornell, a classic up in Ithaca. Penn State 13, Cornell 12 in overtime. Big come from behind win there. And then Syracuse Hopkins on Sunday. Syracuse wins that 13-10. Some notable performances on the men's side. Alex Mariner from Ohio State, he was 3-1 against Notre Dame. And at the faceoff X for Ohio State, Jack Oldman was 59%. Against Michigan, Sam Kane, he gets another shout out this week. 6 goals against Michigan last week for Harvard. Hunter Aquino from Penn State, 1-4 versus Cornell. Eric Maliver, 9 points versus Air Force. Owen Hiltz, huge fourth quarter, 4-1 versus Hopkins. Ryan Croddick, the Princeton goalie. This is my second time shouting him out. He was 83% against Rutgers, 24 saves, only 5 goals allowed. And then Alex Ross, Penn State defender, on CJ Kurst the whole game, held him to 2-1. And he also had one of the best goals I've seen in transition. That shot was definitely moving over 100 miles an hour. On the women's side, just some notable games that stood out. Syracuse played Stanford on Friday. They won that game. Syracuse did 14-13 in double overtime. If you were watching on ACC Network, you got booted there and you had to check out the ending over on Twitter. UNC took it to UVA 20-8. Princeton took it to Harvard 20-6. Florida continues to roll with a 15-9 win over Loyola. Duke continues to impress and improve this season. Duke 12, Clemson 11. BC continues to dominate with a 15-9 win over Notre Dame. And then yesterday, Monday night matchup on ESPNU, Hopkins and Syracuse. This game went to overtime. A lot of back and forth there. Hopkins wins 14-13.
Another defender, another goalie, and notable performances. Look at Coach Rehfuss sharing the love. Although you are dipping into my player recognition territory, so it's going to make me come up with new content. Hey, guys, quickly, because I know we're going to get to our player perspective here. Before we do that, I'm wondering from you two, if you have a quick, just high-level update on your thoughts on the women's season so far. I feel like in the show, we cover the men's game a lot. I'm not able to watch as many of the women's game. Curious, just like quick thoughts on the landscape, first month and a half so far, some of these teams.
Outside of the top 3 or 4, a lot of teams have been beating other teams, right? The rankings are kind of changing each week from that 5 to, call it 12 or 15 range, which has been really fun to watch. I think the biggest storyline for me, and I'm just interested to even see them more late in the season with some of their bigger games. I think UNC is absolutely dominant right now. I think BC, obviously, until they get knocked off, they're the number 1 team, but UNC looks so strong. And, Chloe Humphrey and Ashley Humphrey, what they're doing, not only because they're sisters, but also just the way they're playing from both a goal scoring and assist making perspective, along with a lot of the freshmen that they have. That's a team to me that is really standing out after having, a couple of down years for them from both injury perspective and just from being a young team.
Yeah, I would build off that. And I would say that some of the last couple years, similar to what we were talking about on the men's side, where we got really comfortable with what 22 Maryland and 24 Notre Dame looked like. I think there's been certainly some of that reset with graduation of stars, with Skane and Coy Kendall moving on for Northwestern and some other teams. But obviously there's still, the big trio at Boston College on the attack side. It's like Steve said, the Humphrey sisters, But even more, I kind of thought going into the season that not enough people were thinking about Chloe Humphrey and how dynamic she is as a redshirt freshman. So I'm really excited for that BC UNC game. I think Madison Taylor is continuing to be extremely dynamic for Northwestern, and Stanford and Hopkins have both been impressive to me early season. Again, defensively, but also putting points on the board. Big win for Hopkins last night. So um, I'm really eager to see. I think it's very similar to the men's where there's, a really good group of teams from 3 to 15 that how they play come conference play and then conference tournaments is really going to possibly shake things up and give some new teams some opportunity to get some good seeds and make pushes into the Elite 8, and maybe we see two new teams in the Final Four this year.
Awesome. Yeah, good update. Do Cuse and Hopkins, men's and women's play the same weekend every year? Do you guys know?
No, I believe that was only the second ever meeting between Syracuse and Hopkins women. The other one was,
Wow.
I believe, in 2023 in the NCAA tournament. So not a game that regularly happens.
Great pool, Stephen. Great
Yeah.
pool.
One of the things that sticks out to me, I just think, I think it's mostly Syracuse, but playing these off night games, at 6, 7 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I just think is such a good marketing and branding move because everyone is watching the one game. Like everyone gets to tune into a legit like early week matchup. And I just think it's so good for getting the media attention and the coverage. And it's great for those programs to participate in.
Thursday night ACC lacrosse. I think we only got 2 years of it. And it's gone.
We got the Big Ten Sunday night games coming up soon. We spoke about it before, and obviously there's other things at play with schools' ability to play at different times and the media and streaming. But man, it would be great because it's hard if you want to watch one of the games, or two of the games at the same time. But if you have anything going on Saturday between the hours of like noon and 3 Eastern, you miss all of college lacrosse pretty much, unless you want to just rewatch it or hit the YouTube highlights. So would be great to see some of those games. The Friday nights, the Sunday nights, the Saturday evening, 6 o'clock are awesome. Guys, let's move on here to make sure we get to our players' perspective. Then we'll come back to more of the college talk with our GPUs. Deemer, last week in our weekly thought email on Fridays, we wrote about rankings, and you had some thoughts that you shared with everybody around rankings. What do they mean? I think you had an interesting take on, people like to say rankings don't matter. Well, they are a real thing and they do matter to a degree, but it's just framing and what do they really mean and in what way do they matter? You want to dive in a little bit to some of the points you shared in that email?
Yeah, and I would give a quick plug. If you're not on our weekly thought email, we definitely recommend go ahead and subscribe. It comes out every Friday. It's obviously free, but also all of our latest emails are archived on the site, so you can go back and read this thought, and operates as a blog post. And yeah, it just as the season picks up here and we're getting a pause from recruiting but also trying to think about things that are topical, it was kind of a contrarian thought in my head where we say a lot of cliche advice at times of, hey, don't worry about this or this doesn't matter, focus on this, when in the reality, when you actually put yourself back in shoes as a player, you care about these things a lot. When you put yourself, in possible shoes as a parent who's watching your son or daughter, like we talked about in tryouts, going through these experiences, they matter, because it's affecting the outlook and the mindset of the player. So it matters to you. And so I think, just trying to frame it and to understand, and we get this question a lot, like, how do rankings work? Well, it's pretty simple. Someone is formulating the rankings. They have their way of doing it. They have relationships with certain people. They're going to watch games. They're going to evaluate events. They're going to talk to college coaches, and then they're going to put their best shot at putting out a list that they think is accurate and reflects a point in time. And that's really, you don't have to overcomplicate that, in my opinion. Like, that's how it works. Now, I think we get the question a lot when maybe sometimes it's not seeing the result or where you want to be on that list. And then maybe the instinct becomes like, how can I engineer something different in my control to get a different outcome? And, I think, again, like, just trying to better understand the process is important so that you can realize that you got to just play the game and you got to keep improving. And these things are never going to be perfect. And that's part of sport. And that's part of sports media where people have opinions and you could do all the things right and they're going to still have their opinions, but that shouldn't be the carrot that you're chasing. It can motivate you, it can fuel you, but it's not the end game and it's just a point in time. And so there was definitely a lot of points trying to tie that in that we can keep discussing.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of things I hear and you hear, and by the way, this is not unique to lacrosse. It's not even unique to sports, but people talk about politics and rankings. And politics are part of the process, and they're not always like this intentional, devious politicking that people think happens where it's like, back alley deals to get players ranked. It's just if you know a player better and you've seen them more, or maybe they just appeal to your biases of what a good player is, then that player is probably going to get ranked higher. And I think also we know from running events, it's really hard to rank and evaluate talent where not all those players are playing against each other. You're not always getting the best attack, the top teams against each other. So you're trying to evaluate it in a challenging environment. And so the reason I think that context is important is because just understanding rankings are far from perfect. And Deemer, I think you touched on it in your email. College coaches, like, they're professionals. They don't read the ranking list and go recruit those players. They do their homework. They get their hands dirty. They make calls. They watch games. The best college coaches are great recruiters and they do the hard work. And so while it is nice to get acknowledged in the rankings they can mean something, that's not a one-for-one correlation to you're going to get recruited.
It is tough when you're in high school and maybe someone's ranked ahead of you, you're not ranked, and it feels like it's a really big thing. But one thing that you said, Deemer, just are you gonna let it motivate you? Like, how are you going to respond to this? And I think that's the biggest takeaway, right? Whether you're ranked in the top 10, whether you're ranked in the top 50, top 100, or you're not ranked, right? Everyone has to have a reaction to it. If you're a top 10 kid, well, congrats, but that doesn't really mean anything by the time you get to the next level. If you go and look back at, guys in the top 10, top 20, top 30, you can definitely pick out a lot of guys that, made it and were pretty successful in college, but you can also find the same amount of guys that you never really heard from in college, right? So I think that's important to acknowledge. And I think as for people that aren't ranked, right, just always remember that just because someone's ranked, it doesn't mean that they're going to be a first team All-American. At the same time, if you're not ranked, right, acknowledge one, maybe you haven't been seen a ton, which we're saying, and which is real, right? There's only so many people out there that are doing the rankings and doing the evaluation process, and maybe they're not at the event or the tournament you're at. The other thing is, what are you going to do then as a player if you're not ranked and someone is ranked? Are you going to mope about it? Are you going to focus on it? Are you going to sulk on it? No, what you should do is just take it for what it is and be like, okay, well, I disagree with that. And I disagree with that because of this. And what this is what you then can showcase, the rest of your time in high school. And then when you get to college, when you get to college, no one's really, and maybe you guys had different experiences with Duke and Maryland, maybe after the first day or two of practice, like people know who the ranked guys are, I guess, coming in. But outside of that, no one really cares or looks at it after that. Right. You know, the guys are coming in and everyone's on an even playing field when you get there. So I think that's another important thing. Like when you get to college, it doesn't just mean that, oh, well, they're ranked, so they're in a better spot than me. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah, I would build off that. I would say that there's a lot of talk when it comes to people being overrated or underrated. But what I think is not talked about enough and hard for people to understand is when someone is just rated. Like they're just like standard, average, like middle of the road, and their rating is actually more fair than anything. And so until you break out of that bound upwards or downwards, and you're just kind of rated, maybe you're a 3-star or a lower 4-star player, what are you going to do to push yourself into that next realm? And it might not happen at that level. But going back to the point about like the carrot and your point, Stephen, when you get to that next level, it resets, and it's nice to look back on and have that. And again, when all your playing days are said and done, there's going to be things that you can look to and feel good about that, maybe you were voted captain, maybe you were voted this, maybe you got a coach's award, you're going to have some of those things to reflect on and kind of like your take homes, if you will, but that's not going to be what's fulfilling in the long run. And, I can tell you too that like when you get to some points as well, other people might look at you and say, "Oh, you have this, you must feel so good." But if you're also a true competitor, until you like get to the top, you can kind of be like pissed off to be great, and you're always going to find something that's going to be your chip or your edge. I mean, that's maybe just me speaking from experience. Like when I got second team versus first team, like I was pissed, and it was like I use that in a good way. And I just think that's also how people push themselves to that next threshold as well.
Yeah, and I think, it kind of reminds me of a conversation we had this summer at like one of the PLL weekends with the Whip Snakes, where somebody brought up, they're like, "Hey, asking guys by class, because we range within a 10 to 12-year graduating class range on our team. How many guys ranked in the top 100 in your class stepped on the field and played meaningful roles for their college roster?" And so that was like the premise question. It evolved and it was like, then as a freshman and then as a sophomore, or then like at all, like how many guys ranked in the top 100 went to college and made an impact on that roster? I don't have hard data, but I think the interesting thing was answers from guys on the team just like thinking about it. Some guys said like 30% of the guys that were ranked in the top 100 probably were like impact players on their college roster. And so I just think it's an interesting dynamic of, and that's very anecdotal and that might be totally wrong. But I think the idea is that the impression is that, it's a totally different thing getting ranked in high school and having that ranking and having impact in college. Now, certainly some of the top ranked guys end up being some of the best players. Matt Rambo was a number one ranking and he was great. And that happens all the time. But it wasn't because he was a number one ranking. He was a number one ranking because he was a great player that could do these things. And I think the other thing, is in general, most people think they should be ranked higher, and most people think other people should be ranked lower. It's kind of the normal thing. But then what I believe, and Deemer, you were a highly ranked high school player, and we've all had success at different levels. When you get attention and accolades and recognition, there's like this kind of fraud complex that kind of hits where you're like, am I, like, yeah, I got ranked at this, but am I actually, am I actually that good? I feel like something's misleading. Like, and then you might feel some pressure otherwise. And so it then all comes back to like, are you just doing the things in your control to be the best teammate you can be, the best player you can be, and setting your targets on the right things?
Kind of build off that. And that was kind of the point in the blog and thought where I brought up the NFL statistics. From NFL drafts from 2001 to 2019, there was either a study released by ESPN or an article. And again, like to me, how accurate that 50% number could probably be give or take either way, but it showed a sliding scale. And, they also broke it down by position. But the highest like positions that were re-signing as a first round draft pick, re-signing their second contract with the same NFL team that drafted them was, below 60%. And some of the positions like quarterback and receiver, some of them were almost as low, approaching that 30% range. So I would say, and that's NFL drafts, billion-dollar organizations, multiple scouts, so how are three or four college coaches going to outdo that? Number one. And then how are ranking services going to outdo that? And I think, and again, it's not to slight anyone, it's just also to say the reality of what you can't predict and what you don't have information on is how are these players going to gel with the team? How are they going to build chemistry? And what's their future path of development? What's their growth? Are they going to get faster and stronger? Are they tapped out? Like there's just no way to predict that stuff. And that's where players get skewed in different directions. And you see players all the time come out of nowhere where they were the last commit in the class. And then boom, like their conference player of the year 2 or 3 years later. And I can, again, I coached a player at USC who was lightly recruited in her class, and she finished as Pac-12 Offensive Player of the Year last year. And she's an awesome testament to it. And I think there's these stories on rosters all over the country.
Yeah, I think to that point, it's like some of the things that make the best teammates, especially at the next level. It's a different, college is a different style of lacrosse across the board where off ball play, how fast you cut matters more and your ability to read a situation and pop in space. But like a lot of guys, it's hard to rank guys and girls on that in the club circuit, and not to diminish anything. It's a different format and a different game. Steven, I'm wondering from your perspective, because that was going to be my next question. Like, are there any other things that you like, the reasons you think there's a discrepancy between, high school and ranking success and then translating to the next level. I know Deemer alluded to like how they fit in with the team and things like that.
You're getting evaluated at what, 16, 17, probably not even 18, and you get to college, now you're 18, 19, 20, 21, right? For a lot of people, if you're a late bloomer, right, that's the time when you're starting to take your stride. You're getting bigger, you're getting faster, you're getting stronger. We talked about it last week, but from my perspective, I was a really, really late bloomer. I didn't really stop growing until college. And that forced me to learn a lot of different things all of high school, right? Like different skills, different techniques, which it sucked at the time, but looking back, it was the best thing to happen for me. If you're someone that's fully developed by ninth or 10th grade, right? You're a man amongst boys. Well, now I can lower my shoulder. I can shoot from far out, right? The game, comes easier to you. Okay, well, what happens now? 3 years later, I'm at college and now everyone's the same height. Maybe my speed doesn't stand out as much anymore. My strength doesn't stand out, right? So then, I do feel for those types of guys. It's like you got to reinvent yourself and figure it out. I do think that's a huge piece of it. And that's a piece which, look, like, if Inside Lacrosse is going to watch you play, they can't necessarily take that into account, which is something that I think is a huge piece of it.
I think that's a great point. And I think, the other thing I would say with that is I think when people explain recruits that don't work out, I think we also over index on how hard they work, like as being a reason, like, oh, maybe they got complacent and they don't work that hard. I think we over index on that excuse. And I don't think that applies to as many like lacrosse players as maybe you get that in some other sports that guys or girls get really cocky or into themselves. But I think we over index on that excuse in lacrosse. I think we under index on the pressure and the internal pressure that those players end up going through for getting so much spotlight, maybe wanting to fit in, going through some of that imposter syndrome that Matt, you were kind of talking about as well. And then the bar is so high that how do you just consistently perform, And that's where I think we see like Brennan O'Neill, Joey Spallina, these guys have gone through, and you just hear that chatter nonstop, and then you go down the line. And that's why I do like Matt, you mentioned Matt Rambo. I always just watch Matt and think about his career and everything he's done at every level. And I'm just incredibly impressed, just because he's had so much success. He gives off a more, laid back, like don't care too much vibe, but he's obviously an ultra competitor and he's a playmaker. And it's really impressive to see someone go from level to level to level and be the top guy and then win a title and then win titles in the PLL and be the MVP. It's definitely not that often that we see someone have that consistent amount of success every threshold.
Yeah, and Matt's a special player. One thing I'll say about Matt is Matt loves his teammates. Like he genuinely loves his teammates. And I think that helps get him out of his own head. And the success he has, like what I appreciate about him is I don't see him beating himself up. If Matt is like the hockey assist guy all game and we're scoring a lot, Matt's not like beating himself up over that. I think he's got the ability to score a lot and he's done that for forever. But I don't think that's what drives him is the accolades. And I do think what drives him is just like he's a competitor. He wants to win games. And in a lot of times, his role in winning games is putting up a lot of points, but the points don't come first. And I just think, he's a hilarious, great guy to have on your team, but he actually is super competitive and cares a lot about his teammates. And so just to that point, I think what drives him, he's gotten all these accolades, but that's not necessarily like what makes him love playing lacrosse. I think Matt loves being out on the field with his friends and competing for championships.
I would just say like that's a really cool disposition and where I think the art of coaching and parenting and mentorship comes in is that not everyone can be wired like that. Some people are more, type A. And so the advice there is like, and I would give this advice to myself specifically looking back, like in high school, I do remember putting that pressure on myself, like after being committed to score points and I was getting too caught up in some of that stuff. And then the best advice I got junior year of college from Coach Caputo was he was like hinting at like he didn't feel like I was a selfish person or teammate, which I would say I don't think I was, but I was getting so consumed by some of that dynamic that it was leaving myself in my own head too much versus when I started outwardly focusing on my teammates more just to be intentional about that. That was a good way to get me out of my own head. And again, everyone's advice is going to be different because we just know that we all come from different upbringings, backgrounds, and parenting, and have just different dispositions. So it's a really cool discussion, honestly.
Yeah, I think there's this balance of like being internally focused on yourself, like discipline your habits, what you do. But man, if you're in your own head too much, and I've been guilty of this too, it's easy to spiral. And so making it about your teammates, making it about the team takes the pressure off you. And you're just like, what can I do to serve the team? I think that's a great mindset. So high level here, just before we move on to GPUs, rankings, right? They do matter because they mean something to the players and they mentally can affect us, and we recognize that. We've all been a part of that, but just understanding what they are is important, and that if they're, as Steven said, the carrot, that can become a really toxic, challenging thing. So just putting them in perspective, I think, is the goal. And if anybody's interested in more of it, Deemer wrote a great piece in our weekly thought last week, and we'll make sure we link to that. Guys, moving on to GPUs here, games, players, and units. Deemer, do you want to kick us off this week with your games, players, and units?
Yeah, first off, game Penn State Cornell. We talked about it last week. I think I was saying how I was excited for this and seeing how, Cornell would respond and how Penn State would, kind of bounce back from, winning two of these in a row, and then to come back in the fashion that they did and get a third win, down by 4 with around 3 minutes left, was incredibly impressive. And then doing it without their starting attack unit. Adam Lamberti's coming out with our on the run blog, and he mentioned that as well as not knowing the reason why. But again, nonetheless, big win for Penn State. So I thought that was, a game I'm excited to dive into more. Player, I love watching Owen Hiltz. I think he's underrated. I think he's undervalued. We talked about lefties last week, and just watching him, he's got great touch. He gets the ball out of his stick. He knows when to swing it. He's got great release points off of hitches and time and room shots. So, he's a guy that, I think Syracuse, the more they keep getting him involved and getting him going, he can really lead the offense. He's just not your traditional ball carrier type, which is okay. And we've talked about that in the past before too, with, Brennan O'Neill, and guys like Mark Matthews, and how those lefties play off that wing slot, and a guy like Spallina. And then unit Fairfield defense. They've only given up over 10 goals one time on the season. The team is 7-0. They're obviously having a great run and off to a great start. And they're the number 3 scoring defense right now in the country. So hats off to them. They're a team that I think all lacrosse fans right now would love some more primetime games and some matchups as the season progresses. So looking forward to following them more.
Stags.
I was with a couple Stag alums this past weekend, the Pride and Joy. So looking forward to watching Fairfield continuing to climb.
Big stuff. Steven, you want to go through GPUs here?
Yeah, so my game of the week, Ohio State 10, Notre Dame 9. We talked about it before the weekend. We were curious, what does Ohio State look like? How good are they? I believe they had rattled off 6 wins since their season opening loss to Utah. People counted them out after that first loss. They now have wins over Virginia and Notre Dame. I know Virginia's struggling a little bit, but nonetheless, still a big win considering the talent. And Virginia also has that win over Colgate. But anyways, I was really impressed with Ohio State's offensive midfielders. For the first 4 goals of the game, they were beating their short stick matchups, going to goal and scoring off of it. You don't see Notre Dame get beat too much in a one-on-one perspective, especially from like the 5th and 6th midi. Yes, people attack shorties all the time, but I think, Notre Dame has always done a pretty good job there. But anyways, so they score off those first 4. And then after that, those Dodgers just continued to be explosive, athletic, credit to Ohio State there. They got the Notre Dame defense moving, and, Notre Dame just seemed to be a little bit out of sync. They still obviously have one of the best defenses in the country. They held Ohio State to 10 goals, right? I think huge credit to Ohio State's defense and holding Notre Dame to 9. But that really stood out to me. Player Hunter Aquino from Penn State. He is a freshman. He was 1-4 versus Cornell. He currently is tied for the lead in team points with Trainer with 23 points. He's a midfielder. He has 10 goals and 13 assists on the season. For a freshman midfielder to be putting up these points, that's a lot. For there to be that many assists, you really don't see that often. And he did have the final 2 assists of the game for Penn State against Cornell. They were nothing crazy. They were really just, making the right play, moving the ball. I don't want to say around the perimeter, but just making the right play. But that still counts for something, right? So I'm really impressed by him and looking forward to continuing to watch him play. And, I'm sure he's going to have a pretty strong career. And then Unit, UAlbany man down. They have been man down 14 times and they have not let up a goal yet. They are the only team in the country that is at 100% for their man down unit.
Just so you know, the Whip Snakes were 18-0 on man down this past year. So we'll see how the next 4 possessions go. Just
That's
throw that out
impressive.
there.
Impressive stuff.
Getting the facts out there. That's all. All right. Games here. I will say, just so everybody knows how we execute this, we kind of have a Google Doc. We pick games, and I was last. So I missed the Penn State Cornell game, which was, as I was watching it, I was like, this is the game I'm going to do, because I was actually watching the end. Deemer typed it in. Stephen took Notre Dame, Ohio State. But fortunately, there was a third, what I thought really great game, Syracuse and Hopkins. Cuse won 13-10. It was a great game. It was 10-10 in the fourth, and then Syracuse pulled away. This is one of the most historic matchups in lacrosse, especially when you look at out of conference play. So I feel like Syracuse Hopkins is always a game. I remember growing up, that was like lacrosse, growing up. I remember like Friday night game, the orange and the blue, like really great games. And I think the last few years in this like new era of coaches, we've seen a lot of great games between those teams. And so last year was a 1-goal game. This year, 3-goal. In the series, Hopkins is up 32-30 on Cuse with 1 tie, and that's from 1921 until present day. So a lot of great games there. The series is pretty flat. And just, I really thought that both defenses played pretty well, but I thought Syracuse, the way they play and the way Hopkins play, Hopkins is aggressive sliding defense. Syracuse is great off of ball movement. And now, while I did think Hopkins defense played well, I do think Syracuse exploited that well, which we'll dive into in some of our trends. As far as my players go, I have Alex Ross, who Stephen alluded to earlier. Alex Ross, close defender for Penn State. He covered CJ Kirst, and he also had a goal. So Alex Ross scored a goal. CJ had 2 and 1, I believe, and in Penn State's win. CJ's a great player, and so shutting him down is very challenging. He had a goal off the dodge, I think, against Alex, and one kind of like off-ball cutting goal. But overall, I just thought Alex Ross did a great job. And being able to not totally wipe a guy like CJ Kirst off the stat sheet, that's almost impossible, but to neutralize that threat and just make him part of the offense and their team doesn't have to worry about, that's a big deal. And I thought Alex did a lot of other nice things in, the goal in transition, also just in the flow of the defense. He's a great stick. He's a smart player, covers ground well. Lastly, Syracuse defense, I just thought they did a nice job, especially down the stretch against Hopkins, in a close game where you get to 10-10 in the fourth quarter, being able to finish out the game. Some guys like Billy Dwan, Billy had an assist. I think Riley Figueres is a great player, having a great year, and John O'Dern is doing a nice job with the Cuse defense. So that's my unit there.
What about Ohio State's game-winning goal coming off the invert, which we discussed last week? And I think it was a nice throwback and follow, little same side sneak coming around the cage. So I thought that was cool to see. And yeah, Steve, to your point too, Ohio State getting those middies going. 2 guys that I've just followed more closely because I've gotten to work with them. Gannon Matthews, he came out from Idaho a couple summers ago when he was still at Cleveland State. And then I was really excited to see, Ohio State be interested in him when he went into the portal. And then Liam White, really electric party starting midfielder out of the Midwest, but graduated from Boys Latin. So I think he had either the tying goal or, maybe the go-ahead goal in the fourth quarter. So definitely some guys there for Ohio State to continue to get rolling as they get into Big Ten play.
Yeah, and just doing their job, right? You're that second or third midfielder on the first or second line, right? The ball is going to go through you a decent amount, right? A lot of schools want to attack, those short stick matchups. I was just impressed with their athleticism, not surprised from, Big Ten is notoriously has, big, strong, athletic players. So wasn't surprised there, but nice to see that. And, credit to also Ohio State. I think they've caught a lot of heat when, whether it be behind closed doors or just in the media for kind of their production the past couple of years, for them to rebound off of, an early opening season loss to Utah, which is a pretty good Utah team, but to be where they are right now, credit to them for fighting through that. So pretty impressive.
Yeah, and I think a unit that certainly could have gotten shouted out is Ohio State's defense too. And just I didn't get to dive into that game as much with them. I saw the goals and the ending, but Bobby Van Buren's a guy that, I think as a cover guy is one of the, premier on-ball defenders in the league. And they've done a nice I think Travis Crane's been at Ohio State now for maybe 9 or 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. And I think he does a really nice job. I got to see him present at IMLCA, and just a guy that we knew growing up from the Baltimore area. And so I think Coach Crane's done a really good job building a solid defensive unit. And we're seeing that against the UVA game and now against Notre Dame. Deemer, and interesting, just because you mentioned that game winning goal, uh, Ohio State's goal kind of coming off the big little on the backside or the same side follow, right? And I think that's just one of those examples and not to point fingers because I've been on the wrong side of this too, but at the collegiate level, all those little details matter. And I know like what Notre Dame probably teaches is like, kind of flowing to the ball as the ball moves past you, getting up to GLE and seeing both. The easy thing to do is when you're the pick guy, ball moves past you, kind of turn and watch the ball and see the play, but kind of jumping into that role. And once again, like not the Monday morning quarterback it, but I just think those plays where those little, like really small thing gives the leverage Ohio State needs to win the game, right? And that's when coaches like at the collegiate level, they're hammering these little things matter, guys. Like they do matter. Like your off ball stance matters, like where you flow to matters, your head turns matter, your knee bends matter, and they might not at the high school level as much depending on the talent you're playing. But I think if you're a player that aspires to play at those levels, you want to notice like the stance those guys play with. You want to notice how fast they can run and throw with both hands on the move and how they can hit targets on the run. Like those plays matter. And I just think that was a good example of Ohio State scoring and kind of capitalizing on that and really earning that game-winning goal.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's kind of speaks to too as more of the older guys are rolling off as we come out of the COVID post grads. There's more gaps for replacing, upperclassmen year over year. And so, maybe you get across all teams, you get different guys in different positions that didn't play as much in that position last year. And then some of those little plays add up, or you got a new goalie in cage or whatever it may be. And so maybe someone that you were getting and covering for last year, there's more work in progress early in the season. We can't expect all these teams early March to be so dialed on everything. So I just think some of these articles and predictions around trying to, get the attention or in the storylines around Notre Dame are going to be overdone right now because they're kind of wanting to pile on and, predict like they're not going to be the team they were, but it's because it takes time. And, I was on the call with Coach Danowski today. I'm calling the Providence game tomorrow night down in Durham. And, he was just alluding to some of that too. Like last year, he gave a really interesting stat in their Air Force game last week. I think 13 of the 14 guys that scored did not play any meaningful minutes in a Duke uniform last year, whether that was transfers or freshmen or, a couple guys that just didn't play as much on the offensive end. So it just kind of speaks to like a lot of teams are forming their identities and getting guys in different spots. And, that's what's going to be exciting as we enter conference play across the board.
Yeah, I think you look at the landscape this year and it's exciting. And to your point, people are going to overreact in the short term, right? Like Ohio State loses week 1, people react. Notre Dame loses 2 in a row, people react. I think it just shows that everybody's human this year, and there's still some really good teams. Like we got kind of accustomed to. There was a couple UVA teams I felt like over the years that were really, really good. There was a couple, Maryland 2022, Notre Dame 2024 that were really, really good teams and almost like not human, going undefeated or really taking great teams and having their way with them. I think this year you're just seeing that there are still some tremendous teams, but I haven't seen anybody now that is like head and shoulders next level. I think it's really cool that there's going to be an open market for top teams, and then there's this opportunity as you get to the playoffs for somebody to emerge that maybe isn't playing their best lacrosse right now.
I do just think it's interesting if you guys don't mind spending some time on it. Steve, you were a guy last year that you kind of alluded to being curious around watching Chris Kavanaugh take on the QB1 role with his brother Pat leaving. After last couple games, everyone's starting to really run with that story. How do you define a QB1? Are you buying into it yet? And are we also going to make it seem like Bobby Van Buren, every time he plays a attackman that he matches up well with, that's going to define that other attackman? Is that how we're going to play this season? Or I just would love your thoughts there.
When I look at it, right, if you're the quarterback of the team, right, the team, it kind of runs through you on offense. Or if you're the quarterback of the offense, excuse me. And with it, obviously, Pat has been in charge, and whether he's at X or up top, like Pat has been the go-to guy at Notre Dame. I think Chris is the quarterback, and I think he's done a good job. And I think if you take a look at that Notre Dame Maryland game, it's like, okay, who's our quarterback? Well, who are you going to at the end of the game when it matters? Everyone was turning to Chris Kavanaugh. Chris Kavanaugh, I think he ended the game with 4 goals on 14 shots, right? In that fourth quarter alone, I bet he took around 6 to 10 shots, right? So when the lights were the brightest, he's not hiding. I think, he's done a really good job. I think he's just an ultra, competitor. And I don't even think he's really having like growing pains. Like I still think he's playing well, but I think it's just a different team. It's a different look, right? You're missing a big X presence. He's no longer the only one, that's on that right side or hovering up top, and Jake Taylor inside. It's just a different look, right? It's only right now, we're recording this on March 11th. Like there's a lot of time left. And if I was going to bet on anyone to like figure it out, not that he even needs to. So I don't know if that completely answered your question, but that's kind of how I view it. Who's the team going to? And it's continued to be him. And I think he's, lived up to it in a great way.
Matt, do you define a quarterback any differently when you think about when you're scouting for offenses and you're watching teams play? Like, how do you view a offensive quarterback?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that actually. And I think it depends how you define it. Like, is the quarterback the main guy for the other team's offense? Or is a great quarterback just make the offense better by the way they play it and orchestrate it? And I think those are two different, they can be the same, but they could also be two different things. Like a great dodging attackman might not be a great quarterback in my mind. It just might be a matchup nightmare. When I think of great quarterbacks, if you go back, I think of like a Ryan Boyle, a Steele Stanwyck, a guy Deemer, and I went to the same high school as a couple years younger, watching him play. Those guys, Connor Schellenberger, I think you would call a great quarterback of the offense at UVA the last 4 years, where things go through them, but they're sometimes they're just the conduit, and sometimes they kind of know when to slow it down. They know when to speed it up. They have a good pulse on when they need to score unassisted goals or when they're the assists guy or the hockey assists guy. And they know when it's time to attack an early offense, and they know when to slow. The guy that might put one hand on their stick and palms up and slow the offense down. And so when I think of like quarterback, I'm looking for all those things. A guy that's a great quarterback, in my opinion, is able to score unassisted goals, but that might not be their bread and butter. And so like Steele Stanwyck could score unassisted goals, but he wasn't probably having 4 unassisted goals a game in most games. Like stat line was probably 2 and 4, and able to do that. So that I know that's maybe a definitional thing, but when I think of the word quarterback, I think of like an orchestrator. I think Connor Schellenberger to me is the most recent collegiate example of like a great quarterback at college. And I don't know, to be honest. Chris Kavanaugh, I think, has some of those components because I do think he's a leader there. You can see guys kind of flow off of him. I also think he's a very like slasher type and attacker. So for him, I don't know if that's quarterback's the exact word I would use or not. I do think he's a great attackman though.
It's interesting for sure because I think it also makes me think of what the team needs, and what they're like asking him to do. It makes me wonder, like, is Owen Duffy the quarterback of the UNC offense? Like, because you can take a look at him and be like, he's scoring all these unassisted goals, but he is clearly the go-to guy. You got Dom slashing on the wing, but he is, dodging and initiating a lot from below goal line. So it's a really interesting debate. I think to Steven's point too, when you change guys and you have different people moving in different spots, like it doesn't mean if his totals are skewed towards goals right now versus assists, that he's not the quarterback. Maybe there's a handful that could have been finished that just haven't been early season, right? So I think it will just be fascinating to see. And we also know that when you get into conference play and you get those big matchups, those start to really define a player in their season, right? So it's probably the jury's still out. I think it's too early to say that he's not the quarterback. I think have said this on this podcast before, probably not a guy that I would bet against personally. So I think some of the takes around that are a little premature.
Yeah, and I think just last point, like Matt, what you're saying with like a guy like Steele Stanwick, like that is who I think of like true, quarterback, phenomenal feeder back there, just like picking apart defenses from X. I also think like another way to define it is just like who does have the keys to the offense. Like at the end of the day, who is this offensive leader? Who is the ball going through? And that's where when I'm saying like that fourth quarter versus Maryland, it's like watch that fourth quarter and tell me Chris Kavanaugh isn't the quarterback of this offense. Like, and it's natural for him to have like first off, right now he has 15 goals, 8 assists, 23 points through 5 games. Notre Dame, like they're playing less games than other people. Is he having like these monstrous numbers? No. One, he's the focal point of everyone's scouting report. Two, like he's just adjusting to a new offense. They're running things differently. So saying a lot of the same things, definitely wouldn't count him out. Definitely would not count Notre Dame out by any means. They've won a lot of big games.
McAdory would be another similar one. Like obviously he's bumped up to midfield now, but he's clearly the go-to guy. He's clearly the defined leader and heartbeat of the team. We talked about that last year with like that heartbeat.
Yeah, I think he's like even more of a quarterback this year than he has been before. I talked about, I think 2 or 3 podcasts ago, like his feeds that he's been having, like skip passes over the top. He's been really impressive because you're like, yeah, you take a look at that offense, like he is the guy. Like he has the keys, whether he's from up top or not.
Well, it's interesting because like I'm just thinking real time here too. It's like when you think of quarterback is obviously a football analogy, but quarterbacks in the NFL have changed. Like pocket passers versus these
Modern game.
Yeah, and so you think about like no, and it's I think it's relevant because there's less just guys that sit at X now. And so where, there was a time where you did want an X, you like recruited an X attackman that you wanted to be two-handed, push pipes, and that's still a thing that's relevant. But now Chris Kavanaugh, they move them all. He dodges from up top a lot. I think another question, an interesting one, is like point guard, and that's a little bit different. Where like a point guard's a facilitator of the offense to me. Like Mike, and maybe Michael Jordan was a shooting guard, right? And so maybe played some point guard too, but clearly the go-to guy for that team, but wasn't supposed to be the facilitator, was supposed to be on the scoring end of it. So I think it's another like analogy if you wanted to go basketball, like maybe Steele was more of a point guard and Chris Cav's more of a shooting guard.
I just don't want Chris Cav to get like, oh, he's not the quarterback because he's like too much of a slasher. Like he's too good of like a 1v1 dodger. And
yeah,
it's like,
I'll give you that. I'll rescind my statement because my definition of quarterback was definitely, as I deconstructed it, was like pocket passer. And I'll give you that one. Okay.
I'm not even going at you. That's what I'm saying. Even like Steele Stanwick, like he's on the slower end of like star attackman. Like he's not really running by everyone. He can.
Steele Stanwick's Peyton Manning. That's what Steele Stanwick's like the Peyton Manning.
Like it just because Kavanaugh can like fly past people and he's a slasher doesn't mean he can't be both.
Yeah, it's a really good discussion. And we've talked about the modern game on this. So as the game becomes more positionless, as people put people in a lot of different situations, the role of the quarterback clearly is evolving. And so I don't think it's probably just to use the old definition, but also it's going to depend on each offensive style, but I think you can have different quarterbacks on different teams that are playing different ways because it's very similar to Matt, your comparison of the pocket passer, how Mahomes and Lamar Jackson play, right, are different than how Jared Goff is playing, how Peyton Manning played, how Tom Brady played, but they're all the quarterback. And those guys, Mahomes and Lamar are redefining that position. And I think this is very applicable for McAdory, Kavanaugh, and Duffy, because again, Nate Kabiri, more of a quarterback for the Princeton offense. All right. But maybe McAsee is a little more the quarterback. Like it just depends how you define it. Sam King. Would we say Sam King is not the quarterback of the Harvard offense? but Sam's doing a lot of different stuff in a lot of different ways, but they initiate with other guys too, so it's a very interesting discussion that I think we should dig into more going forward.
There's ways to win without like, that true classical. Like you take a look at 2018, Yale wins the national championship. Like Ben Reeves, like quarterback, like, he's at X going lefty, righty. Okay. You take a look at 2019. Well, there's Matt Moore and there's Michael Krause. Who's the quarterback of that offense? I don't really know in the classic term of like, someone at X that's throwing feeds. I think they're both slashers from the left and right side. There's just different ways to go about it and different ways to win.
Yeah, I think, and we can wrap it up here. I do think, just Deemer, to your first question about like how do you think about scouting a quarterback? When I look at an offense, like just to pull back, I look at who stirs the drink is a phrase I always like that I think, I don't know, like we used to say at Maryland when we looked at scouting reports, like who stirs the drink of the other offense? Like who without is that offense really stale? And a great offense like that can be at times multiple players from multiple spots. The more limited that is as a defense, the more you can work to disrupt the stirring of the drink, if you will. And so I kind of look at who's the initiator, who can draw slides and create advantages, and who do they look to do that. And then that might be the quarterback, or it might be like a Dodger. And then like who kind of is the conduit? Like you stir the drink, who do they try to get it to like make sure it's capitalized on? In what way? Is it a through X up? Is it like a throwback and is they try to redodge? And so just at a high level, that's kind of, and not all offenses are the same. Some don't really have a stir the drink guy, but they stir the drink with actions and triggers, and they have multiple guys that can do it in different ways. So it's tricky. Some have really good dodgers and athletes that can stir the drink with one player over and over and capitalize off it. So to your guys' point, I think there's a lot of different ways, and we're seeing offenses get more creative as to how they stir the drink, how they use or we define a quarterback, just because teams are getting more creative in how they set up offenses and attack, which I think naturally brings us to our next point here, which is a trend we wanted to talk about, ball reversals. And so ball reversals, we wrote about in our Coach's Corner newsletter on Sunday. Deemer had some great points and clips talking about unscripted offensive flow, creating defensive flow, and how offenses can attack that flow. So at a high level, like as a defense, offense starts dodging. A defensive unit wants to flow with the ball, right? If the Dodger starts dodging down the field, you don't want the rest of your guys staying far outside of the box. Defenses want to flow with the ball in the direction the ball is going. And I think offenses, understanding that, have done interesting things to attack the flow. One of them is talking about ball reversals, where the ball flows one direction and quickly getting the ball to reverse the flow opposite direction. Deemer, do you want to run us through, however you want, maybe a couple high level, what you think about attacking the flow of the defense?
Yeah, I think in general, flow is something that it takes feel from the players. It's really hard to pinpoint every single example where an offensive player should reverse the ball as opposed to keep it moving. But there's definitely some themes and concepts that arise. I think when you get a good initiation dodge and you attract the attention of the defense, that's where you're starting to draw some rotation. And then as that play progresses, as the ball is moved, that's where then you can really attack the flow. If you swing it quickly backside, you're going to set up quicker, shorter dodges that an offense can take advantage of, and an approaching defender. If you throw it forward in situations a lot that we see, throw it forward to a player at X behind the goal, whether it's an alley dodge or a wing dodge that goes underneath. Now, as the defense you draw the slide and the defense starts to recover, that's where that player who's catching it has decisions to make. Do they reverse the flow and attack it by throwing the ball inside against the grain? Do they skip it back up top against the grain, against the flow of the defense? Do they attack off a dodge, or running back to where the ball was thrown to with the ball, where now, again, maybe you're jamming up some approaches with a pass down, pick down. There's different ways to do that. And then I think the other ones that are a little less off the dodge, but more set things up, are the relay pass, which we saw a good one with Spallina, where, ball's thrown down, he's about to run off the pick, and then he just swings it back up top, before he utilizes the two-man game. That's a really interesting concept that can draw attention one way and attack it from another, as well as we loved from the Slap and Glass podcast and newsletter, the idea of the boomerang pass. Swing the ball in one way and then swing it right back and attack off the dodge. So there's some really good concepts there. And, Steve, when I think about you as a player too, I think you're someone that had a lot of really good feel for these. You were playing on the wings, but you were also playing at X. So, would love to hear your perspective on it.
Yeah, I think the ex attackman, this is where a lot of the responsibility falls on them, to, as we're saying, like quarterback the offense, right? What direction is the ball going to go? And the first thing you said was, something along the lines of it takes a lot of feel for the game for it to be executed correctly. When I see a lot of these attacking the flow and relay pass stuff like that, like all of that comes from it really can't be predetermined. So, if you're an ex attackman and say the ball is coming down the alley, right, you have to read where your defender is playing you. I think on a couple of clips where we saw Spalina throw it back up, right, Scott Smith was on him and wasn't really, he was pushing him so far out where if Spalina was to catch it, he would then have to run all the way through X in order to get a pass off to the backside. So I think, you really can't predetermine it as an offensive player. I think coaches that can train their ex attackman and whoever the one or two guys back there, right? You have to see what the defense is giving you and then react from there. I always loved throwing the ball back into the grain of the defense because I thought, it just get them all dragging one way. Okay, now put it the other way. Now it's really hard for them to defend.
I feel like a lot of coaches, especially early on, say attack opposite, right? And so that becomes the first, and it's a very fundamental piece, and it makes sense. Like if you're playing against a team that does flow to the ball, catch and attack opposite, and that's one obvious way. But when you start to do that, now if a team's good at flowing, they're going to start pushing opposite even faster because they think the ball's going back opposite. So I think there's this deceptive way of almost, Steven, you're talking against the grain, catch it, drifted, X opposite, everybody starts flowing, and then you go back to where it came from. That's a challenging thing to defend. I think we saw in the Cuse Hopkins game, Hopkins' style of play is an aggressive sliding system. They drop a hot guy, they extend to X, they get ready to rotate over. Cuse was able to get it to the backside fast. And that's where Hiltz had a couple shots against approaches. Raul got a left-handed step down as a righty, kind of shot low to high near side, great shot. But half of Cuse's goals, I think, were really just attacking the flow against an aggressive sliding Hopkins defense. I think you look at the opposite. When Maryland played Cuse, they didn't flow as much. They kind of hedged adjacent and compact, played tighter because they didn't want to allow Cuse to attack the flow, which they do really well.
I think, the best ex attackmen and guys back there, right? It's constantly switching it up, right? You don't want to spend the whole first quarter attacking the flow and going against the grain of the defense because then they just get used to it, right? But if the first possession you do it, the second possession you don't, the third you don't, but the fourth you do, right? You keep the defense on their toes. And that's the game within the game, right? Manipulating the defense, manipulating your defender. If you watch Spalina at X, he's always working. Is it a hang up? Is it not? Which just puts a whole other, added pressure on that defense there.
It can also really depend on how you teach your players to go through these progressions. A term that we would use a lot at Duke was forward, inside, through, especially in like the invert game. Like you knew you had your forward look where you could swing it up top. You'd look inside to the defense, but then you'd also look through. But if you limit your players to saying, we have to master the forward before we can throw it inside, before we can throw the skip pass, they're not going to get the reps needed to go through those progressions. And so same thing with, if it's always attack opposite, well, there are scenarios that we're clearly seeing where not attacking opposite results in some really good plays. If you always bring the ball back to where it came from, you're not going to probably create the maximal amount of advantages. If you always swing it backside, you're not going to create the maximum amount of advantages. And so learning to decipher that, I think, is really big. I think about a lot that attacking the green concept, playing the point and man up. That was one of my favorite things to do. And you catch the ball coming from one side. If you change hands and start turning your shoulders to the other side, you get the defense flowing in that direction, and then you can skip it back to the pipe. I see Matt starting to smirk over there. So that to me is like, you can use your shoulders and your posture to manipulate the flow of the D, and then you can reverse the ball or skip it through. And so I think that's what really good attackmen are doing, but also teams can learn to manipulate more.
Should I explain why I'm smiling here, Deemer?
I feel like we might have already gone through this before, but
I think we did it with when we did it on the Tillman podcast, maybe. Well, a quick story. Deemer, we played on the same high school team at Loyola Blakefield. Deemer would always throw this back pipe skip from the point and man up. And fast forward, we're freshmen in college. I'm at Maryland, Deemer's at Duke. We're playing Duke. And Coach Tillman in the scouting report meeting goes, "Oh, Matt, you went to high school at Deemer. Got any more like points on him?" And I'm a freshman and I, didn't usually speak up in these meetings. And I go, "Yeah, he likes to throw skip passes to the back pipe." And everybody in the room just starts like laughing at me because it's like so specific. And everybody's like, "Oh, your buddy likes to throw skip pass." Like, nice. In the game, Deemer threw a skip pass to the back pipe. It ran up. And I felt so vindicated that I think I intentionally let it through. I was like,
You
fine.
were
We're just gonna
cheering
give it
on
to
the sidelines.
him. I was
Were
I
you
was
were
on
you
the
on the
field and I
field?
had
You
my
were the
stick
guy
out.
in the lane. You pulled your stick
Yeah,
out of the lane
I was supposed
intentionally.
to
Be
be
like,
in the lane. I was supposed to be in the lane and I just let it through.
yeah, you were sandbagging Coach Tillman on that one.
You actually have like a piece of
It
information
wasn't
that can
Coach
help.
Tills. Coach Tills appreciated the information. It was everybody. It was all the older guys on the team, like the juniors and seniors and stuff.
But it's the most classic thing. You have information that could actually help, but like you're freshmen, so people are like, "Oh, like man, like that's so
Well,
lame."
that
Like
would
it's
that would
just
happen.
personality. It's like
That would happen from time to time where somebody would give, like, really specific, non-actionable advice on, like somebody, "Oh, he likes to do this." Like, "Yeah, but, we haven't seen him do that all year," you know? It was just funny. I always laugh about it, and I just can't not bring it up.
Yeah, it's a great conversation. And we also saw it in the Duke Clemson game, Duke women's their game winning goal, uh nice ball reversal against the Clemson zone defense. So I think against zone 2, it's really big. And we see it in basketball, like going against a zone, you got to get it moving in one direction and you got to figure out your time to reverse the ball as the defense is making their shifts. And so Clemson was pressuring out, ball was thrown to X, and then kind of high near side player like times her cut, and the ex attacker takes 2 steps back towards where the ball came from with the ball on her stick and makes a nice feed. So you can catch, take 2 steps opposite, come back same side. Like there's so many different subtle ways to do it, but those ball reversals are really crucial because if you just keep the ball going the same way all the time, it's going to be really hard to generate a meaningful advantage to score the amount of goals that these offenses need to score to win games.
And I would say the flip side of this is, as a defender, the ability to play passing lanes and have great stance and have head turns to see the lanes and just understand where to be on the field is so important as these players offenses get better at it because when you flow, you do leave far guys open. And so there are open guys. They're just supposed to be the least dangerous guys. But as flow changes quickly with ball reversals, who's dangerous and who's not dangerous changes very fast. So to counter that, you kind of need to be able to play through lanes to deter those quick passes through the defense. A phrase I always liked was, as a defense, you want the ball to go around you, not through you. So like allow the ball to move around the perimeter to the adjacents and get out to them. But as soon as the ball starts going through you, it's really challenging because that's quick ball reversals. Steven, you wanna get into looking ahead here into the weekend.
yeah, so some notable games, 3 on Saturday that are standing out. Princeton at Cornell, that's at noon on Saturday. Duke at Richmond, also at noon on Saturday. Maryland at Virginia, 4 p.m. Saturday, ACC Network. And then on Sunday, we got a good game, Ohio State at Denver. Early season for that Ivy League matchup to be happening, right? We're just at like the start of March. Usually this game is later and has, some big implications. It still will. And, this is a huge treat just in terms of for the lacrosse fans. What is it? Probably a top 6 matchup right now. I think Princeton's ranked, maybe number 2, Cornell, maybe number 6. So really looking forward to that one. And excited to see the Duke Richmond one. I think Richmond just continues to be impressive and not an easy win by any means.
Yeah, I would say chiming in there, I'm excited to see Princeton versus Cornell offenses. I think that's going to be really exciting. I think Richmond and Duke is going to be a great game. Richmond's had success against Duke in the past. We also have their defensive coordinator coming on our coaches community in a couple weeks. So we definitely recommend signing up and checking that out. We're excited to learn from him. And then, Ohio State, Denver, that's just historically a great game to watch. And, Denver needs to bounce back after a tough loss against Yale. And Ohio State is rolling right now. So it'll be interesting to see that style and that game come together. So I'm excited to watch. And The only other one I'd mention is maybe a Millen versus Will Schaller, high school club teammates squaring off against each other. So that's going to be a really fun one to see.
Coach Richards, Paul Richards from Richmond, 1 week from today in the community. And I think the staff and Coach Richards has been there for maybe since inception. Deemer, is that correct? About 10 or 11 years at Richmond with Coach Chamati. I believe Paul's been there the whole time. And my brother played at Richmond for that staff. And I think that staff does a great job. Paul's a guy whose brain I've picked many times. Richmond has run a great defense, one of the, top defenses in the country for years. And in a world where they don't always get the ACC Big Ten type recruits. So I think it's a lot of slide recover and they do interesting things. So I'm excited to have Paul on to kind of break down the way he teaches defense and how he thinks about it philosophically.
Yeah, 11 years, Matt. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in today for another episode of the FCL podcast. Make sure you check out our socials along the weekend. Stay tuned for our weekly thought coming out this Friday. And then Sunday will be off for Coach's Corner. So, make sure you join the over 300 coaches now that are subscribed to the Coach's Corner newsletter next Sunday. But excited for a great slate of games. And thanks for tuning in.
All right, fellas. See ya.
See ya.